This virtual conversation between Helena Cobban and Richard Falk was pre-recorded for the Friends of Mount Diablo Peace and Justice Center for screening on May 20th, 2022. For more information or to download Just World Educational's report, Ukraine, Stop the Carnage, Build the Peace, please visit www.justworldeducational.org.
Richard, we've heard, some very likely veiled threats from President Putin about, the fact that if the West crosses certain red lines, then he has extraordinary capabilities that we all know about. Does this bring to your mind a similarity with the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Yes, it's a similarity, though it's veiled in greater ambiguity, because it's hard to assess whether Putin is basically bluffing or is really feels that if these red lines are crossed, he will exercise the nuclear option, because from his perspective, Russian security has been put in jeopardy, or his leadership has been profoundly challenged. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was that element of who would give way, and the problem of not backing down in the face of a perceived threat. But there were the issues were very concrete and tangible, and it was clearly not just a bluff on the Russian Soviet side, and on the American side, somewhat similarly to the Russian reaction with respect to NATO and Ukraine. This was seen as a unacceptable intrusion in our sphere of influence. And we had respected the Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. Otherwise, World War III would have started, likely, if we had tried to protect the Hungarian uprising in 1956 or the East German developments in 58, and later the Czech Spring, and so on. So that it was very important in at least taking steps to avoid the nuclear dangers in the Cold War period, that both the Soviet Union and the US respected traditional spheres of influence. Now, Blinken, the Secretary of State, has made very foolish comments that suggest to me a level of surprising ignorance, when he says, he's been quoted as saying, well, spheres of influence are a bad idea and they should have been abandoned after World War II. If they were abandoned, we probably wouldn't be here speaking, because it's very likely that the fragile East-West peace would have been shattered by in the course of these kind of crises, without this mutual recognition of spheres of influence. So we have a different situation now.
Right. I mean, the US obviously has a traditional sphere of influence in the whole of the Americas under the Monroe Doctrine, and it looks as though under the unipolar situation that existed from 1991 until last year, it looked as though successive American presidents were pushing the Monroe Doctrine, worldwide, making it a global thing.
Global. Even though explicitly, as you know, Monroe Doctrine was repudiated by American leaders and supposedly replaced by a good neighbor policy.
Right.
But that dissipated quickly after the Cuban Revolution, and in which I remember hearing Arthur Schlesinger speak at Princeton saying that a Marxist regime was incompatible with the values of the hemisphere and therefore couldn't be tolerated. And today, with the attitude toward Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba, we still de facto practice Monroe Doctrine diplomacy. And as you say, after the end of the Cold War, we assumed a kind of prerogative to be the guarantor of global security, a Monroe Doctrine for the world. And what's happened has been that China and now Russia are challenging unipolarity, and on behalf of a multipolar kind of world order, which is supported largely by the people of the South. They prefer that kind of equilibrium to a unipolar dependency on the US to run the world.
Yeah. So after the Cuban Missile Crisis, I think they grew up. I was still very young at the time, but they grew up like.
They're still very young. It's all relative.
It is all relative. That's true. There was a much more lively understanding that in order to forestall these kind of crises in the future, you need to have, much better communications between the two leaderships. And in fact, you need to find ways to manage the nuclear arms race. And therefore, in the decades after the Cuban Missile Crisis, you had, this whole structure of arms control agreements and of course, the hotline between Washington and Moscow. But then with the collapse of the Cold War, which was I have to say, very elegantly managed by the first President Bush and Secretary of State Baker, in order to allow, the Soviet Union was collapsing, Warsaw Pact collapsed, but they didn't seek to rub the noses of the Soviet/Russian leadership in their defeat. And the fact that you could have such an intense and lively nuclear confrontation defused over the course of a couple of years without a crisis was a real triumph of diplomacy. But since then, I think Americans and people in the other NATO countries have become very lazy and disdainful of that whole concept of arms control and ramping down the nuclear arsenals and maintaining good, solid, clear communication with Moscow. So a lot of that arms control structure was dismantled, and the hotline was turned off. We're in a worse situation now than the world was in the late 80s, for example. Is that right?
I think it's largely right, although I would dissent a little bit from your endorsement of the way the Cold War was ended. It's true that there wasn't a triumphalism expressed in terms of humiliating the Soviet Union further. But instead of trying to get rid of these nuclear weapons at that point, there was an opportunity that was missed. You could have had a much stronger UN, possibly eliminated the veto, and move toward a serious phased nuclear disarmament. That was a lost opportunity. Instead, the geopolitics of victory led the US to see the opportunities of unipolarity. No longer had to worry about what Moscow thought, and it was accustomed to by the constraints of a bipolar world, and it felt liberated by the collapse of the Soviet Union and no geopolitical challenger in sight. And so it proceeded to establish and maintain all these hundreds of bases, foreign military bases all over the world.
And to push NATO further to the east. I mean, all of that happened
against the advice of the most knowledgeable Soviet experts like George Kennan and Jack Matlock, the former ambassador to Moscow. And this is quickly dismissed recently by people who focus on this Russian aggression against Ukraine, but they do forget that these warnings were very solemnly made by the most informed American experts on the Russian security sensibility. And I think it's not clear in retrospect that the US and the West really won the Cold War, because we've, instead of taking the opportunities to create a safer, more humane world, we created the conditions for a much more fragile world order. We suffered from what I would call geopolitical hubris and thought that we self-anointed leader of security everywhere, and the only legitimate form of government, and a lot of delusionary ideas that and it was true for the Democratic Party leadership as well as the Republican. I mean, when Clinton's doctrine of enlargement with respect to democracies was based on the idea that if more countries could become like us, then there would be peace in the world. And what happened instead was this revolt against democracy. And we now have a sort of frightening trend toward populist autocracy, or autocratic leaders selected by popular will, including almost having it happen here in the US.
Well, we did for 4 years.
Yes, we did for 4 years. But you could make the excuse it wasn't clearly enough understood. And at the end of the 4 years, Trump was narrowly defeated. But it's according to current polls, if the election was held today, he would defeat Biden by a considerable margin.
So coming back to what we did at Just World Educational in March, which resulted in the this little publication.
Oh, you mean this one?
Yes, that you and I ran, this this series of webinars that I think was really worth doing. But it still occurs to me that there's a lot of people in the younger generation who are not aware. I mean, we in our webinar series, we did quite rightly end up with a wonderful session on the nuclear risks. But most people in the younger generation haven't had to deal with this, haven't had to deal with it either intellectually or emotionally. I mean, there is definitely an emotional component to having to think about what Herman Kahn called the unthinkable, which is nuclear annihilation. And annihilation not just of all human life on Earth, but of just about all life on Earth. I mean, that is hard to think about. But if you want to really come to grips with it, you need to understand a lot about the nuclear balance, how we got where we are, how the world got transformed from the US having 2 tiny nuclear bombs that they used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in order to bring an end to World War II, how we got from that situation to one in which there are 9 recognized nuclear weapons states, many of them in highly contentious places like India and Pakistan or Israel, North Korea. But at the core of it, you still have the world's 2 largest nuclear arsenals are ours and the Russians. And so we're back in a situation that anybody under the age of 45 has never had to deal with. Like, how do you deal with this nuclear risk? I don't know if you have any ideas about that, or ideas of what we should do to educate the next generation.
Well, I think what you were saying is the first imperative, and that is making people aware both of the historical experience of possessing these weapons of mass destruction, and how essentially lucky the world was that they were never used in the period of the Cold War. I think the best book on the early nuclear diplomacy was written by Martin Sherwin, who shows by examining the interaction at the Cuban Missile Crisis that it was sheer luck that there was not a exchange of provocative violence that would in all likelihood have led to the use of these weapons. And I would point out also that E.P. Thompson took the point that a country that prepares to wage nuclear war is itself walking a very treacherous moral path. To premise your own security on a announced readiness to kill tens of millions of people, innocent in every relevant way, as well as to contaminate the earth for generations to come, is something that undermines any kind of cultural moral fiber. And I think we've lived with this willingness to use these weapons and to have a kind of nuclear oligarchy in the world. Why some countries should have them without any restrictions. The 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council were the first 5 to acquire these nuclear capabilities. And the rest of the world suffers from a threat of intervention if they dare to acquire the weapons to uphold their security. For instance, Iran has a much better case to acquire nuclear weapons than the US does, for instance. It's really jeopardized by stronger threatening neighbors, and yet it has been warned that if it should do this, it will be subject to military attack. So that there is this nuclear apartheid world system that is ingraining this kind of unequal character of the world's structure in a way that I think is unacceptable. And therefore, a popular movement and a movement from the global south, which did result in the passage of a treaty, the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which was came into force in 2021, I think it was, and is a challenge to the 9 nuclear weapon states, none of which are among the signatories to this prohibition treaty. So we have an issue that is very fundamental. And I have always drawn a distinction between arms control, which aims to stabilize the nuclear environment and make it safer against miscalculation and accident and excess expenditures, and disarmament, which is eliminating the weapon. And the two things are not compatible. You can either work for stability or you can work for a transformed world order based on denuclearization.
Which seems today more urgent than ever. So thank you, Richard.